to the site, and we have to keep in mind that, of course, what is happening at the site right now is not cleanup. They're not actually trying to mitigate the disaster itself. They're just trying to keep the effects of that disaster under control. And in order to do that, of course, they have to keep reactors 1, 2, and 3, the melted down cores of those reactors, constantly cooled by continually pumping in water, which is continually leaking down into the basements and contaminating groundwater flowing through the site, which is a huge and ongoing concern because, of course, there are just giant reservoirs of water that are being created of this contaminated water that they're attempting to store on site. But when they collect that water and put it into storage tanks that they've specially built on site for that purpose, the storage tanks themselves are leaking. Another example of this, in order to try to mitigate some of the problem with the groundwater flowing through the site, they've tried to build some bypasses to try to catch some of that groundwater before it flows through the basements and becomes contaminated. But they've just come out in the last week or so, TEPCO has come out to admit that they don't know if this is having any effect at this moment, and they're still waiting to see if this will actually do anything. And of course, people have probably heard about this idea, this plan for an ice wall that they're going to build, a 1.5 kilometer perimeter around the plant to try to freeze the soil in order to stop the groundwater from flowing through the site. But again, this is completely experimental. This has been tried on very small scales before, but nothing of the size and magnitude of what they're trying now. And the timetable that was originally proposed for this of March 2015 seems that it's probably not going to come to fruition because of the problems they've been facing during the experimentation phase of this. So again, just about every aspect of what they're doing seems to be one step forward, two steps back. And unfortunately, that's the holding pattern that we've been in for a few years now. And because in late 2011, the Japanese government and TEPCO declared that the site was in cold shutdown, that was, I think, the point at which a lot of the media interest turned away from the issue because it seemed like everything was under control. But it's an ongoing problem. And as I say, every attempt to try to control that problem seems to be facing setbacks of its own.
But the interesting thing, James, at least from what I've seen, is that in the immediate aftermath of Fukushima, the government that was in power then, led by the Democratic Party, said, okay, we're done with nuclear power, we're going to start phasing it out. But when they were defeated in the next elections by the Liberal Democratic Party, the mood shifted, and Shinzo Abe's government has now said, hold on, nuclear power is still the best way for Japan to be energy independent. How are people reacting to that? Is there a lot of pushback against the government for wanting to reintroduce nuclear power?
Well, as you can imagine, this is obviously a very polarizing issue, and there are people, obviously, with economic interests and with other interests at stake in seeing the continuation of the nuclear status quo here, and then there is a very motivated anti-nuclear movement here that really does want to use this as the springboard towards the possible elimination of nuclear power from the islands of Japan themselves. And this is obviously still ongoing, but at this time, the nuclear industry really has the upper hand because, as you say, once the Shinzo Abe government came in late 2012, the idea of scrapping nuclear power was abandoned, and in fact, plans are to continue with the nuclear status quo. This is causing a lot of strife and turmoil. There's a lot of political turmoil going on here, not only related to the nuclear issue, obviously also related to the military, the militarization of Japan, related to the economic issues happening here. But I think they are all forming a piece, and it means there is a political movement that really is motivated and energized around this nuclear issue towards the idea of eliminating nuclear power. But it seems to be the wind has gone out of its sails since the LDP government of Shinzo Abe came in. And all of the really remarkable steps that were taken under the previous government, including that proposal to eliminate nuclear power, and including the fact that previous government commissioned a report that actually concluded that Fukushima was a man-made disaster because it could have been prevented, it should have been foreseen because of all of the problems in the situation of the plant. These are pretty remarkable steps for a country that has been so wedded to nuclear power throughout much of the last half century, and all of those steps seem to have been erased with this new government. So there are certainly people who are against that, but the political momentum seems to be on the other side.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Casey Morell. We're looking at recent developments in Fukushima and also looking at some of the challenges reporters face in covering stories like these in Japan. We are joined by James Corbett, the founder of FukushimaUpdate.com, and by Steve Starr, who is the Program Director of Clinical Laboratory Science at the University of Missouri School of Health Professions. I want to remind you that you can listen to this and other full episodes of Global Journalist on our website. That's globaljournalist.org. And for more Global Journalist content, you can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. Now, gentlemen, we only have a few minutes left. I'd like to ask you both what you think the lasting legacy of this incident is going to be. Are we going to start to see more countries that have been avowedly committed to nuclear power, start to move in the opposite direction? We've seen Germany say that it wants to phase out nuclear power. France wants to reduce its commitment to nuclear power from the 75% that it has now down to about 50%. Is this part of a new trend that we're going to see, or do you think that it's something else, that maybe in a few years, once Fukushima fades back into the subconscious, we're not going to see these pushbacks anymore? James, I would like to start with you.
I think we're already starting to see the revivification of the nuclear industry, which obviously I think had to lie low in the immediate wake of this disaster. But at this point, I mean, Japan is once again going out and trying to export some of its nuclear technologies to other countries, and we see these plants and new plant construction is being proposed in a number of countries. India looking at the issue, and it is still a political struggle in a lot of places, and there are still a lot of opposition. But these projects are still going ahead, and the industry is still around at this point. So I'm not convinced that at this point that Fukushima really will be a turning point. But it could at least be a hallmark for future conversations, and I think will be a touchstone for future projects wherever they pop up. I'm sure Fukushima will enter into that conversation.
Do you think, James, in some way that it will be more of a rallying point or a touchstone, as you said, for the groups that were already committed to being anti-nuclear? In other words, it's not something that's necessarily going to persuade people who were in the pro-nuclear camp to go the other way?
Yes, I think that to a large extent, this probably hasn't changed the mindsets of the people who already had their minds made up on the nuclear issue before this point. It may have swayed some of the people who were undecided, but I think a lot of the people who were already polarized on these issues are unlikely to change their positions because of them. Although there are some notable exceptions, and sometimes in the opposite direction. For example, there was the Guardian journalist George Monbiot, who of course writes on environmental issues, who famously said that he now embraces nuclear power because Fukushima showed that it's a relatively minor thing when a nuclear disaster happens. So it's kind of strange the way that this is played.
Well, I don't know how he does his math. I mean, I think if you look at just the cost of the property, the homes, the agricultural land, the industry that had to be abandoned in the exclusion zone, and the cost of the cleanup, we're going to be pushing $500 billion. So that doesn't seem like a bargain to me. Arnie Gundersen said that you can run a nuclear power plant perfectly, and then you can have one bad day after 40 years, and you can ruin half a country. And I think that's definitely been illustrated. I didn't mean to interrupt you, James.
I agree completely with your assessment there, and I think that is the part of this that gets excluded from the conversation often,
right.
And that's particularly acute here in Japan, where of course the taxpayers are being asked to burden a lot of the cost of this cleanup and mitigation, and that's directly in the fact that TEPCO, of course, has been essentially nationalized. The controlling shareholder is now the Japanese government, or the agency that they created to deal with the cleanup, and tens of billions of dollars have already been pumped into this.
Right. Could I suggest that we're a long way from seeing the end of this? One of the things that's not discussed is the spent fuel pools that are still sitting in blown up reactor buildings, and the tops of these pools are 100 feet above ground, and they've gotten about half the fuel out of spent fuel pool number 4. But if that pool were to collapse, if there was another major earthquake or tsunamis that would strike there, if that pool was breached and the fuel was spilled on the ground, they wouldn't be able to get within a couple hundred yards of it. They'd probably have to abandon the site, and that would lead to further massive radioactive releases. All these nuclear power plants that they put on the coast of Japan and even South Korea are in range of North Korean missiles, for example. You don't have to have a nuclear weapon. You can drop some conventional warheads on spent fuel pools and make most of these countries uninhabitable. So there's a lot of things that don't get talked about problems with nuclear power plants, but I think we will be hearing about them in the future.
So, Steve, in your estimation, then, excuse me, nuclear power always a non-starter, no matter where it is?
Well, I think if you just look at the economics right now, they're not. The nuclear power is going down the drain because they can build gas-fired plants cheaper, but they don't. Nobody ever talks about what the real cost of trying to store radioactive fuel for 100,000 to 1 million years. They don't know how to do it. We've got this giant cavern in New Mexico that was, Nevada, that they were going to bury the stuff in, and then they realized it wasn't designed properly, and they choose these areas for political reasons. But how do you isolate anything from the biosphere for 1 million years? And is it worth it so we can keep all the lights on in St. Louis all night long? I mean, I think the trade-off, the volume of radioactive stuff is small, but it's so incredibly toxic that if it gets into the biosphere, it's toxic at the atomic molecular level, and that's why, when you talk about what happens when it gets inside the body, which is what the safety standards like to not address, I think, and don't properly address. Those are the kind of problems that, we have a problem that's going to last for 2,000 or 3,000 human generations that we're creating with this waste. That the next 2,000 human generations are going to have to manage this stuff. And I think that's really, what are the costs of that? I think that's really a terrible mistake to just keep making more of the stuff with the assumption that somehow we'll find a way to take care of it.
Well, gentlemen, I think we're going to have to leave it at that. It's definitely a topic I think that we could easily spend another half hour to an hour discussing, but unfortunately our time today is up. I'd like to thank both of our guests, James Corbett, who is the founder of FukushimaUpdate.com, and Steve Starr, who is the Program Director of Clinical Laboratory Science at the University of Missouri School of Health Professions, who is also a former board member for Physicians for Social Responsibility. Our lead producer this week is Varvara Fomina, with assistance from Olga Krustaleva, Jessica Anania, and Batul Hassan. Travis McMillan from the Reynolds Journalism Institute is our technical director, and Pat Akers from KBIA is our audio engineer. Thanks again for listening to this edition of Global Journalist. For Jim Flink, I'm Casey Morrell, and we will see you next time.